The vast majority of American infantrymen sent to the front lines of the Vietnam War between 1964 and 1973 were those aged just 18 and 19 years old. In fact, 30% of all troops in Vietnam were aged just 21 or under. Thousands upon thousands of young men who had never held a gun in their lives were ordered to leave their homes and head into a terrifying hellscape from which they may never have returned. What awaited them was unlike anything their wildest nightmares could have conjured. Intense bullet fire, wet and often filthy conditions, and the chance of encountering determined guerrilla fighters at every turn. Today, we put ourselves into the shoes of a 19-year-old soldier sent to the Vietnam War, experiencing the horrifying descent into battle which so few of us could even begin to imagine in 2026. We will discover how these young men were conscripted and trained, how they entered battle, and how, tragically, many of them would die. Welcome to Wars of the World. Of course, plenty of Vietnam War soldiers, even those of a particularly young age, were already in the military at the time that the war broke out. Conscription, otherwise known as the draft, was implemented in the early 1960s, with the United States military growing increasingly reliant upon it by the midpoint of the decade. The methods in which young soldiers were conscripted into the military changed across the course of the 1960s. Prior to December 1969, following your 18th birthday, you would enter your local selective service office and register with the military. Soldiers would be selected for conscription based upon their age. Recruits from age 18 to 26 were drafted, typically on an oldest first system. The local registry boards had to fill certain quotas of men drafted into the military on a monthly basis. In 1969, however, the United States military introduced a lottery system for conscripting new recruits. This was brought about following complaints that the previous draft system was unfair. Soldiers conscripted under the old draft system could opt to defer, for example, if they were completing college studies. This was biased against lower income men, however, and so the system was rehauled on the 1st of December 1969. The new lottery system was based on a conscript's birth date, with 366 balls, each with a date written on them, were drawn at random from a rotating drum. The first ball to be picked was the 14th of September, meaning that all young men born on that date would be first in line for conscription. Ball after ball were drawn, creating a queue of dates, forming the order in which men would be conscripted into the military, meaning those whose birthdays were chosen at the end could often relax, as it was unlikely that they would be required to fight. In general, conscription was considered to be deeply terrifying amongst young men in the United States over the course of the Vietnam War. It created a constant air of underlying anxiety and uncertainty, and it suddenly became very hard to plan for the future. Many young men had no interest in joining the military, or they actively feared the idea of having to march into battle and aim a gun against another human being. But this rapidly became the monstrous reality for many. Conscription could lead to the permanent alteration or premature ending of a young man's life, and the system was unpopular. Moreover, the Vietnam War was viewed by many of these men as a war without a clear purpose, and conscription was only feeding the massive waste of life brought about by this conflict. Once a young man was conscripted into the military, he would begin a mandatory 2-year period of service to his country. This usually meant serving in the army, and many conscripts would see the terrifying action of battle. If you refused to serve, you may have been met with a prison sentence, or a dishonourable discharge. Those who had been drafted soon underwent a physical exam to ensure that they were indeed fit to fight, swiftly followed by a 4 to 6 month training period. This training period itself was a grueling, extremely fast-paced process, designed to quickly transform ordinary young men into hardened soldiers. Men with no prior military training were forced to undertake rigorous physical challenges, and were pushed to their absolute limits. Drill instructors were often extremely strict, and put the men under their command through obstacle courses and fitness routines designed to test even the hardest of soldiers. Often, if a recruit found the training process difficult, they would be singled out by the instructor in an environment of constant, extreme pressure. Outside of this intense physical conditioning, recruits were provided training on marksmanship, patrolling, and military maneuvers. As the war progressed, so did the way these soldiers were trained. Over time, the training process had become more specialized to suit different scenarios and conditions on the battlefield. Given the fact that many of their enemies in Vietnam would be guerrilla fighters, special training was provided on how to spot signs of such warfare. Some soldiers would report that across this period of time they were not given actual weapons to train with, forcing them to learn quickly when they were eventually deployed. Following the training period, soldiers would usually receive a period of leave before commencing on their typically 12 to 13-month long tour. This would often be their last chance to see their families, spend time with friends, and to participate in the things they enjoyed before they were deployed into the horrors of the battlefield. It was one final period of a fractured, uneasy calm before they were sent into the worst scenes unfolding on planet Earth. Tragically, many would never return. After training, wave after wave of 18 and 19-year-old recruits were deployed into Vietnam, and many would see intense combat across their tour of service. New arrivals, often referred to as cherries by experienced personnel, were typically given a 2-week orientation and training top-up period, which was often inadequate for the harsh realities that many of them would face on the battlefield. The newly arriving soldiers would often replace those whose tours were ending, resulting in a constant, revolving stream of units coming in and out of Vietnam. Vietnam was like nowhere many of these recruits had seen. Intense monsoon rains would hammer the ground, turning it into a thick sludge, which, combined with the dense jungles and the mountainous terrain of the countryside, made it extremely hard for the soldiers to get from A to B. It was not easy for the soldiers to fight in such intense heat and humidity, especially while they carried all of their equipment, weaponry, and ammunition. The jungle concealed its own hidden dangers too. Leeches, mosquitoes, and ticks were common adversaries, but not as dangerous as the multiple species of venomous snakes that lurked in the undergrowth of the jungle. It was much harder to fight what was already a massive uphill struggle, when it seemed like the very environment itself was turning upon you. And then, of course, there's the combat itself. Many of the young men conscripted into Vietnam had never even held a weapon before, let alone aimed or shot at another human being. For many, this would have been a form of psychological torment, as many conscripts didn't even agree with America's presence in Vietnam in the first place. Mental health conditions such as post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and intense anxiety would have been prevalent in this environment that was not fit to accommodate them, and the emotions felt by these young men would have gone unaddressed for months, if not years at a time. If the concept of war in itself wasn't enough to terrify an inexperienced young soldier, then the general format of the way the Vietnam War was being fought certainly would be. There was no clear front lines in Vietnam. Soldiers were constantly facing Viet Cong attacks from multiple directions, and it became extremely hard to tell from where or when the next attack may come. American troops adopted the tactic known as search and destroy in order to deal with their enemy. This involved sending troops deep into enemy territory to seek out a hostile presence before doing anything they could to neutralize it. It was risky and certainly controversial, and resulted in a great loss of life. Successes on the Vietnamese battlefields were typically measured in body counts rather than territory gained. Many areas were swept through and often abandoned, resulting in the Viet Cong simply taking back the very same territory which the Americans had fought and often died to capture. This made it extremely difficult to tell which way the war was going, which only added to the constant stress and disillusionment experienced by the American soldiers. The Viet Cong used unconventional methods in order to repel American forces, and would have been extremely difficult to prepare for during training. Utilizing guerrilla warfare, the Viet Cong typically specialized in brutal ambushes, attacking thick and fast before retreating into the jungle just as quickly as they had emerged. This meant that a terrifying attack could burst from the foliage at any moment onto an unsuspecting American patrol, and the Viet Cong's capability of taking their enemy by surprise was frighteningly effective. Moreover, the Viet Cong were adept at improvising on the battlefield, using the tricky jungle environment to their advantage. They built networks of tunnels underneath the forest floor in order to hide from approaching enemies, which made them extremely difficult to take out with airstrikes or gunfire. The battlefields of the Vietnam War were often constricted in nature, forcing combat into close quarters. This allowed the Viet Cong to utilize homemade traps, taking advantage of the American soldiers. A popular and particularly effective style of trap was the use of what is known as punji sticks, sharpened shafts of bamboo that would be concealed in pits below the forest floor. Unwary Americans making their way through Viet Cong territory could fall through the trap's coverings and find their legs or feet impaled on the bamboo, and if that wasn't enough, these bamboo spikes could be smeared with mud or even feces, encouraging their wounds to become infected. The Viet Cong would also booby-trap jungle passageways, using grenades with shortened fuses. These were often triggered by tripwires, which, when set off, would immediately blast the surrounding area to smithereens. In other instances, the Viet Cong would capture the venomous snakes residing in the forests of Vietnam, and confine them within pitfall traps in the earth. Soldiers who fell in would often find themselves on the receiving end of searing venom, of which there was very little chance of survival in the depths of the Vietnamese jungle. The guerrilla tactics utilized by the Viet Cong were extremely efficient, especially against the inexperienced men conscripted into the United States military. They would use the Ho Chi Minh Trail to easily move supplies and troops from the north as the Americans advanced, and they had a seemingly endless reserve of troops. This was in part due to the fact that the Viet Cong utilized civilian support. They embedded themselves in local communities, fostering miniature alliances across the land. American troops found it difficult to distinguish between fighters and civilians, a very intentional move by the Viet Cong to give themselves the upper hand. An estimated 58,220 American soldiers died over the course of the Vietnam War, and over 150,000 more were wounded. Given the fact that many of these soldiers were young and inexperienced men who had no choice but to fight for a war